So I'm going to speak for about 45, 50 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. If you've got any questions, it's probably best to save them until the end, because part of the structure of the talk is to try and build different arguments on top of each other. So it's a little bit like a jigsaw, that if we focus on one part of it, the effect won't be quite as good as if you wait until the end. That's the theory anyway. It may not work out quite like that, but that's what I tell myself. So I'm going to speak particularly about racism and education. So a lot of the insights you'll need to kind of translate into your own particular working arena. I think some of the insights will be very directly applicable. Others may not be. Some of them may be a bit more general, but I think you'll certainly be able to make those connections as I go along. And as I say, very happy to enter into discussion at the end for as long as you want about how some of these things may or may not translate into your own particular work environment. So it's a great honour to be here speaking about these things. It's also a little bit strange, because part of the emphasis of my work is about not just the things that we know, but the things that we don't know. So I'm very aware that as an academic from England, there's an awful lot about the situation here that I don't know. Having said that, we live in a globalised world where a lot of political and demographic shifts happen not just across countries, but also across continents. So I think there are certainly some aspects of the situation here which are directly applicable, and maybe some of the differences will help us to understand our own situations a little bit better. So I was asked to talk in particular about the issue of racism in relation to policy and practice in education. And as I talk, these are the issues I'm going to try and cover. So first of all, to say something about the ideas of race and racism. In particular, I'm going to outline what I'm going to call a critical understanding of racism. The idea of what racism is and how it might manifest itself. Then I'm going to say something very briefly about the demographic situation in England, so that you can see some of the comparisons. And then I'm going to look in particular at how racism operates in practice through the actions of teachers and policymakers. And finally, I'm going to say something about what I've called flashpoints. So controversial questions, issues that over time in different nation states keep on reoccurring. Questions about censorship, about whose insights carry most validity. And I'll try and say something there about not just the particular issues, but maybe some principles that we can adopt in taking forward our understanding of those issues. So if we start with the idea of race and racism, as you probably know, it's widely accepted that there's no such thing as separate human races. There is one human race. The idea of consistent, biologically defined subgroups, which we can legitimately call different human races, has been exploded over certainly the last 30-odd years. The physical characteristics which are usually taken to denote race, things like skin tone, those characteristics are given different meanings at different times and in different societies. So although we kind of grow up thinking that race is obvious and fixed, a kind of natural thing, it's actually not obvious or fixed. Race changes over time, and it means different things in different societies. So for example, I could stand with a friend in the departure lounge at JFK in New York, and say to the Americans in the departure lounge, is my friend black? And the majority of Americans would say, yeah, your friend's black. We get on a plane, we fly to Rio de Janeiro, we walk into the arrivals lounge, and we say to the Brazilians in the arrival lounge, is my friend black? And the majority would say, no, your friend's not black. Because black means different things in the US to what it means in Brazil. And it means different things in the US now to what it meant 40 years ago, 100 years ago. So although we're presented with race as if it's a fixed biological thing, it's not. It's an invention. It's an invention which is continually remade over time in human interaction. Now, because of that, some people put quotation marks around the word. So when they use the word race, they put a quotation mark around it to say, well, I know there's no such thing really, but I have to use the word. Some academics say, well, if there's no such thing as race, we shouldn't use the word. That's quite a nice argument in a university seminar room, but it doesn't work very well in the real world. Because if you want to do something about inequalities that are associated with race, getting rid of the language doesn't help you. It's difficult to address racism if you refuse all language connected with race. So it gets very messy. The terms that we use keep changing, and our understanding of the issues changes from time to time. So it feels very uncertain. But the guiding principle for me is always what helps us to understand where the inequality comes from and what we can do about it. So if it means that my book published this year uses terms that are different to the book published 10 years ago, so be it. There are more important things than getting hung up on a particular word at a particular time. So I'm going to particularly look at the issue of racism. Racism is a complicated idea, and it changes over time. Now, traditionally, we tend to think of racists as folks that look like that. It's a bit unfortunate that my hairstyle matches the archetypal racist, but I'm just trying to subvert the code, you know. So traditionally, we associate racism with kind of neo-Nazi, clear white supremacists. The idea that dominates in the media and politics is a very stable and actually a very narrow view of what racism is. So the dominant perspective sees racism as something that's quite exceptional. It doesn't happen very often. Racism is a conscious act by people who know what they're doing. It's driven through race hatred. And we might identify racism through the use of hate speech or through deliberate acts, often of quite a crude or even a violent nature. So in the traditional perspective, racism doesn't happen often, but when it happens, it's very obvious and it's willingly enacted. Racists know who they are and what they're doing. Now, in contrast to that image of racism, a critical perspective has a very different view of what racism is and how it operates in society. And very often it operates through people who are smiling and well-intentioned. Very often the smile is not knowingly false. In education, some of the key race inequalities arise through the actions of people who are really trying their best. So a critical perspective on racism views racism as something which is extensive and taken for granted. Racism as something which is a daily occurrence for many people in minoritized groups. And I use the word minoritized. I came across this first when I was doing some work in Canada, and scholars there were using it to kind of remind themselves and others that being a minority is a political construction, like being a member of a race is a social construction. So we tend to imagine that certain people are minorities because they're born a minority, whereas actually to become a minority is part of a political process. In terms of the globe, people that look like us are the minority. So even the terms that we're using to try and understand the debate sometimes smuggle in a slanted understanding of the word. So when I talk about minoritized people, I'm talking about groups that have been kind of created through political and historical processes to have a particularly different status in certain nation states. So in a critical perspective on racism, you can't identify racism by only looking for crude and obvious acts of race hatred, because racism is much more subtle than that. So in a critical perspective, you identify racism through the effect of actions and policies. If an action or a policy has the effect of disadvantaging one or more minoritized groups, then its impacts may be racist regardless of its intentions. Now, this is vital because policymakers talk a lot about their good intentions, but what matters from a critical perspective is the impact of decisions, not the intention behind them. So one of the particular kind of controversies I'm going to talk about later is an approach that's sometimes called colour blindness. The idea that, well, if we ignore race and treat everyone the same, that will guarantee fairness. Now, actually, that's one of the best ways of normalising racism, of taking race inequalities and making them look natural. And I'll say quite a bit about colourblind approaches. One key example is very often if you're looking to recruit someone to a course in higher education or to a job, if you just say, well, we don't accept people with qualifications below this single cut-off point. And the argument is, well, it's fair. If you have qualifications below this level, we're not going to consider you. But if you live in a society where certain minoritized groups have significantly less overall educational achievements, then if you design a single cut-off point, what you're doing is disadvantaging a larger proportion of that minoritized group. So if you say, we're going to teach degree courses, but only to people with a single level of qualification. Below that, we're not going to accept anyone. In the US, you will automatically be rejecting a larger number of African American students. In the UK, you'll automatically be rejecting a larger proportion of Black Caribbean students and students of Pakistani ethnic origin, for example. Without ever mentioning ethnicity, by just having a single cut-off, you make that decision, whether you're aware of it or not. Now, critical perspectives often focus on how policies or actions that present themselves as being fair, despite that facade or that intention, have the impact of remaking existing race inequalities, sometimes even making those inequalities worse, despite the best of intentions. Now, before I talk in a bit more detail about the research from England, let me just give you a very brief picture of the demographic background in England. England is a society that overall tends to imagine it was entirely white until the Second World War. And that is entirely wrong. The term Great Britain was coined by an invading army from Europe. So the land mass that's called Britain has never been ethnically homogeneous. I was saying earlier, in some of my teaching, I use a proclamation that was issued by Elizabeth I 400 years ago, which licensed a Dutch trader to walk around London, round up black people and take them out of the country. And although it's written in Elizabethan language, it's written in the language of Shakespeare, the argument is very familiar as the same argument that many political parties use today. So the argument is the people who really live here and deserve to live here are angry that these other people have crept into the nation and are taking their resources. So this is 400 years ago in Elizabethan London. So the idea that ethnic diversity is new is a lie. But it works in the favour of particular groups to imagine that they have a kind of divine right to a certain piece of land. Now, in England, the majority of the adult population define themselves as white British. About 80% of adults in England and Wales describe themselves as white British. A key component of ethnic diversity in the UK is the historical involvement of Britain in the transatlantic slave trade. The Industrial Revolution was built on the slave trade. It's not often presented that way in history books. It's presented as being built on the entrepreneurship and the invention of the British. Actually, there would be no Industrial Revolution without the slave trade. People talk about globalization now. The first global trade was a trade in human beings. So again, this idea of how certain words take on particular meanings. So 80% of the adult population define themselves as white British, but the minoritized population has a much younger age profile. So in certain areas of society, like education, things look very different than they do to the adult world. So when we look at the population of children as they start school, aged 5, 65% of the school population are defined as white British. And in certain parts of the country, like Birmingham, where I work, like London, white British children are a minority in the school system. So the kind of image of the nation that dominates politics is very different to the image of the nation that you see if you walk around schools. And that's quite important, again, for the mismatch between rhetoric at the kind of national level and the reality on the ground in certain parts of the country. Now, in terms of overall achievement, different nations measure achievement in education in different ways. In England at the moment, the dominant measure is in the exams that kids take when they're age 16. Do they get 5 or more higher pass grades, including pass grades in English and mathematics? And this shows the proportion of kids in state schools who reach that level of achievement. And as you can see, the highest achieving group are children who identify their family origins in India. The majority of these students in all of these groups were born in the UK, but they trace their family origins back to countries which have a particular colonial relationship with the UK. If you look at different census categories that are used in the States, they're different to the ethnic categories that are used in Britain. Every country decides its own categories that make sense in terms of its own historical and contemporary makeup. Now, there are many, many more ethnic groups than this in the UK. These are only the largest ethnic groups. So these are the groups that have at least 5,000 kids in the cohort each year. So Indian students are the most likely to reach that level of achievement, followed by Bangladeshi and white British kids at around 60%. And then achievement for other minoritized groups gradually gets lower and lower, with the lowest achieving group here students who identify their family origins in the Caribbean. And the low achievement of this group, this one here, so-called mixed race, we're all mixed race actually. The census category in the UK is called mixed race, some people call it dual heritage. And this particular version is where there's one white parent and one black Caribbean parent. And their achievement also tends to be following a very similar pattern to kids of black Caribbean ethnic origin. Now, that pattern with black Caribbean kids achieving consistently less well than the white British group, we've known about that certainly since the very first ethnic monitoring back in the early 80s. Black Caribbean parent groups were complaining of it way back in the 1950s and 1960s. So this pattern is not new. There is a long-standing argument about where it comes from. And the argument betrays something of the different understandings of racism that I showed you earlier. So one set of arguments you can think of as a kind of deficit model. So they say, well, why is there always this inequality? Well, it's a problem with the kids or their families. This is the model which dominates policy discourse. It dominates language in the media. So why do black students do less well than white students on the whole? Well, they're less intelligent. They have less ability. Some people still cling to the notion of IQ. And periodically we'll see publications arguing that on the basis of the latest statistics, black people are proven to be genetically less intelligent than white people. This argument has been destroyed academically for at least the last 30 odd years. But it refuses to go away. I'll say something more about ideas about ability and what it is and who has it. I'll say something more about that in a little while. But this argument about intelligence refuses to go away. And one of the reasons it refuses to go away is that it makes white people feel better about their own privilege. It's not our fault, we just happen to be clever. And it also serves particular political interests. The studies that come out of the US about race and intelligence are funded on the whole by a very small number of very right-wing interest groups, think tanks. So the work tends not to meet basic scientific requirements, but gets a lot of publicity because it's funded to the tune of millions of dollars. If they're not arguing about ability, there's a very common argument about effort. Well, some kids just don't work as hard as others, and you know, some groups are lazy. You know, this is a long-standing stereotype. Again, going back to the days of slavery. So the argument is, well, black students don't do very well because they just don't work hard. They're more interested in having the right trainers or in music than they are in achievement in schools. That argument is very powerful, despite the fact that actually the research evidence suggests that black students have higher aspirations of themselves in education and spend longer on their homework than white kids of the same gender and social class background. Another argument is that, well, black families aren't as supportive. They're more disrupted, they're not a stable background. And again, there's lots of research evidence to show that the amount of support that black students receive extends beyond just the people in the household that they live in. They have wider networks of support, and that black parents tend to have higher educational aspirations of their children than their white counterparts. So these arguments, the research doesn't support these arguments, but they're continually paraded in the media and in politics. Arguments that take what I'll call a social justice perspective tend to focus, rather than focusing on, if you like, the victims of inequality, these arguments focus on the system. How is inequality made and reinforced by the system? And part of the argument is here what I'll call intersectional inequalities, the influence of class, gender, disability, sexuality. These kind of axes of differentiation, ways in which the population sees itself as broken down and is treated differently. These all have an impact. But in terms of understanding race inequalities, I'd argue possibly the single most important issue is racism. And a lot of people in England, well, and elsewhere, think that I'm mad because I argue that. Because the idea that black educational achievement, which has been at this lower level for decades, the idea that that is a result of racism in the system, for many white people is unthinkable, because they hang on to the image of racism as something which is done by neo-Nazis and skinheads. So how can that kind of racism still be present in an education system in the 21st century? But if you shift to a critical understanding of racism, then suddenly it becomes clearer how racism actually saturates the education system through the kind of routine, day-to-day actions and procedures which don't stand out. It's just how schools operate. So racism becomes a kind of normal part of how the society works. Now, for more than 2 decades, there's been a growing amount of research in schools, particularly qualitative research. So research that involves people interviewing teachers and students, sitting in on lessons, just walking around schools and seeing the life of the school. These studies have been done by different researchers of different genders, different ethnicities, funded by different groups, working in different schools in different parts of the country, but they tend to have findings which are remarkably consistent. In terms of black British students, the findings continually suggest that white teachers' expectations of black students typically underestimate their ability, but overestimate an element of challenge and threat. So to put it bluntly, white teachers, when they see a black child, tend to be on alert for signs of trouble. They're not on alert for signs of academic giftedness. Black students are more likely to be disciplined than white kids who are involved in the same activity. But they're less likely to be placed in high-ranked teaching groups than white kids with the same levels of attainment. And overall, teachers tend to assume that black families are disrupted and not supportive of education. As I've already said, that's a stereotype. It's absolutely not borne out by the evidence, but it very powerfully operates in the staff room when teachers talk about black students, and it operates when teachers make decisions about which kids get what kind of teaching. So these perspectives are absolutely vital because they change the kind of education that kids receive. Even black students taught in the same room as white students by the same teacher, research suggests they tend to get a different kind of experience. They're told off more often, they're praised less often. They cover less of the curriculum. And in many education systems, there's selection as kids move through the system. So increasingly, black students wind up in lower ranked teaching groups where they're taught by less qualified teachers and they cover less of the curriculum and, of course, end up doing less well in examinations. But this all happens through a series of processes that kind of operate on a lesson-by-lesson, day-to-day process. There's nothing dramatic or obvious about this. It's very much that kind of more subtle form of racism, although the impacts are just as dramatic. Now, that's the view of kind of what happens in the classroom, very often you can't understand what happens in the classroom without understanding the wider kind of policy framework. What priorities are being set by local and national policymakers. So we also have to think about wider policy contexts. And policymakers often assume that colourblind policy is the best way forward. And by that, I mean an assertion that we're going to treat everyone the same. We're going to be blind to colour. I've been to schools where head teachers say, well, we don't notice what colour people are. We treat everyone the same. And very often they really mean that. But when you go into a classroom or you look at the detention book to see which kids are being held back or which kids are being expelled from education altogether, they're not treating everyone the same. In fact, the history of humanity is that human beings tend to be very sensitive to colour. So the argument that we treat everyone the same sounds great, but very rarely is it borne out in practice. I'll give you one very clear example of this. So I've already mentioned that for about 20 odd years, research has shown very consistently, this is one of the most consistent findings in research on race and education in the UK and in the US. If you ask white teachers to rank their students according to a measure of ability or motivation, white kids are overrepresented in the top groups and black students are overrepresented in the bottom groups. Now, because it's such a consistent finding, back in the early 2000s when Tony Blair announced that the British government were going to bring in something called a Gifted and Talented Initiative. We're going to identify our most able 10% of students and they'll get the best teachers, they'll get more resources. Anti-racists were very alarmed by this, and I gave my inaugural lecture in London. When you become a professor in England, you're expected to do a big public lecture. You profess. So I professed about racism in the system and said the Gifted and Talented Initiative will make racism worse. And the education department was so impressed that they issued an official rebuttal. And they said the Gifted and Talented scheme will identify children by looking at ability rather than attainment to capitalise on the talents of the individual child regardless of ethnic background. Now, if we had longer, we could spend a long time taking this apart. In particular, the idea that ability and attainment are different. So this reflects a very common assumption that ability is something in here, kind of a fixed potential. Some people are high ability and some people are low ability. Whereas attainment is just how you do on a test. They're different. It's a very common assumption. It's entirely wrong. There is no test of potential. Every test that's ever been devised, if you're given structured instruction in things that are relevant to the test, on average, your performance will improve. It doesn't matter if it's a driving test or if it's an intelligence test. So if you don't pass your driving test first time, we don't say to you, I'm sorry, you don't have the ability to be a good driver. You're going to have to just ride a little moped for the rest of your life. We say, well, you better have some more lessons. You have some lessons. For most of us, our performance improves enough to pass the test. Great. Unfortunately, in education, we tend to give kids certain tests and go, oh, look, this kid's done well. They're high ability. This kid's not done very well. They're low ability. And then we put them in different groups and we treat them differently. And then we say 10 years later, well, look, these have done really well. We told you they would. They were the high ability kids. This is how education systems tend to work. So it's kind of worrying that the education department buy into that myth, even though it's been absolutely debunked by very respectable academic kind of panels of the greatest experts in psychology have rubbished that idea. But the education department still hangs on to it. The other thing that comes across from this is just the total confidence that the education department has. There's no way that a gifted and talented scheme in England will have racist outcomes. Of course it won't, because we're going to deal with the individual child. This is a statement of colourblind policy. We're not going to worry about race, we're going to deal with the individual child. Well, 3 years after the rebuttal, the government published the first ethnic breakdown of gifted and talented numbers, although they published it in a paragraph at the end of a document and made no announcement about it, and they didn't even draw a graph, they just put it in words, so you could very easily miss it. If you didn't miss it, the data suggested that teachers were identifying about 1 in 10 white kids as gifted and talented, compared with 1 in 25 Black Caribbean students and 1 in 50 Black African students. And this is the model of how policy operates in terms of race. Policies are proposed with no awareness or concern for race equality. Activists point out where the problems will lie. No action is taken. Eventually, over time, the racist outcomes become clear. Government, if we're lucky, takes some kind of remedial action. Usually, they take no action at all. This is a pattern that repeats over and over and over again. So in societies where racialised stereotypes are deeply ingrained, societies like England and I'd suggest Sweden, race equality concerns have to be built into policy as a conscious element. Because if you don't build in a concern for race equality, what will happen is that the normal functioning of the system will reproduce race inequalities. So this kind of obscene outcome is the result of countless small little acts of racism that aren't dramatic but happen on a day-to-day basis and have that kind of cumulative outcome. Now, I mentioned earlier about intersectional issues. Whenever I speak about racism in England, particularly when I speak to predominantly white audiences, people want to talk about social class. They don't want to talk about race. They say, well, isn't it really about class though, Dave? Class is a lot more important, isn't it? Now, social class is important, gender is important, disability is important, sexuality. These things are all significantly related to differences in how people experience the education system and other agencies within society. I think the emphasis on social class and gender in England is because white people generally feel more comfortable talking about them. White people are uncomfortable talking about race. We're not sure what words to use. We don't feel that we really understand the issues. Whereas gender and social class, we kind of feel a bit more ownership of those issues. Now, there's a growing amount of research that looks at how these different issues intersect. How does race and class and gender work in particular situations? And they don't always work in obvious ways. So you can't just add up the inequalities. So a black working class female will be more disadvantaged than a black working class male because you've got racism, patriarchy and class. Doesn't work like that because the way the sexist elements of the stereotypes of black boys tend to lead to much more aggressive disciplinary measures in schools. So black boys tend to do much worse than black girls. So the ways in which these different elements intersect is vitally important. We're getting more and more research on that. We don't have enough research about that at the moment, but I think there's a danger of some people saying, well, wow, this is really complicated. You know, we really can't say anything at all. It is complicated, but there is quite a lot we can say. And I'd point to two particular things. One is that racism is always intersectional. The way that racism operates and is experienced is always inflected to some degree by issues of class and gender and disability and sexuality. In the same way that gender is always inflected by class and disability and race. So there's a very long-standing argument within feminism about do white middle-class feminists get to speak for black working-class women and the kinds of issues that become erased when that happens. So all of these issues are intersectional, but they also have their own key characteristics. So intersectional issues don't explain racism. It's not good enough to only look at gender or to only look at class and say that, well, those are the big issues, and if we take care of them, we'll bring black people along with us. Minoritized groups will benefit, as everyone will benefit when we focus on class or gender inequalities. Actually, the evidence suggests that if you only focus, for example, on class inequality, race inequality doesn't just continue, it gets worse. Let me give you an example of how these different things intersect. A recent project that I did with my colleagues Nicola Rollock, Stephen Ball and Carol Vincent, we interviewed black middle-class parents about their experience of the education system. There tends to be an assumption in England that virtually all black people are automatically working class. That's not the case. So we talked with middle-class black parents about their experience of school when they were young and their experience now as parents as they try and guide their children through the system. We've published some of the papers. If you Google, you can find some of it. We're also working on a book that pulls some of this together. And one of the elements that I particularly looked at was around disability. How did issues around special educational needs, how does that work through the experiences of the black middle class parents that we talk to? Because there's an assumption in the UK that class explains everything. So these parents are in well-paid jobs with a professional education, they know the education system. So the assumption would be they will be able to use special educational needs to get more resources for their kids. That isn't what we found. What we found was that schools view low achievement as the norm for black kids. So when a parent said, well, there's a big discrepancy in how my child's performing. On some tasks they perform brilliantly, and on other tasks they perform really poorly. Now that can be used as an indicator of a learning disability. But what happened to our interviewees was that the school said, well, you know, that low performance, that's all they're capable of. And when the parents said, but yeah, they do really well with their homework though, when they're not up against the time limit, they do brilliantly. And the school said, well, are you helping them? Maybe they're getting it off the internet. So the overall assumption was black children don't do well. There's nothing special about that. It's not a disability, they just don't do well. When the parents, because these are middle class parents, they researched it for themselves, they paid for private assessments which diagnose particular learning disabilities, sometimes the school would simply refuse to act on that. They would just refuse to take notice of the assessment. Other times, this was the most common response, oh, right, that's really interesting, right, okay, great, right. Nothing happened. parents would go back continually. We have one parent that went in with a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, who not only explained the condition to the head teacher, but offered to do free training for other teachers in the school so that all the staff could understand the issue and what they needed to do. And they were never invited in. What we found was that special needs assessments, when the parents asked for them, in almost every case the school said no. The only times when the school said, we think a special needs assessment was good, was when the pupil had been experiencing racist harassment, so their achievement went down, and the school said, oh, we think there's a problem with the child. So you remember earlier I said about deficit analyses. So even where the parent had brought the racism to the school's attention, and in one case where the school had said, we apologise, we've let your son down, the parent then got a phone call at the weekend saying, actually, we think there's an issue with your son. We think he needs an assessment. So despite the social class position, the advantaged position of these parents, they're in well-paid jobs, they have professional educations, they know how to use the system, didn't help. The system, the overriding issue in terms of how the education system dealt with them was about race. So many times people will say, well, certain identities are more important than others. Class is more important than race. Disability, if you have a disabled identity, that's bound to be more important than race. No, if you look at how these things intersect, race is often a critical aspect of these issues. Now, before I wrap up, I want to say something about some of these flashpoints, areas of controversy that continually reoccur, not just in different societies, but in the same society over time. We could probably draw up a list of about 50 flashpoint controversies around ethnic diversity. I just want to address 2 or 3 and then we'll open it up for discussion. The first thing to say about these is that there isn't an easy answer. That part of the reason why these issues keep on reoccurring is that there's no obvious solution. Another reason why these issues keep reoccurring is that they're about racism and about power. And groups with power like to hang on to power. So some of these issues that question the status quo become very heated politically because they address deeper underlying issues than the particular issue that you might think of as being at stake when you read the newspaper article or you get a phone call from a journalist asking you for a soundbite on the latest controversy. So what we continually have to do on these is to examine our own assumptions and, going back to that critical perspective, the consequences of our actions. So not just producing a statement of principle, but thinking about what's the consequences of what I just said? Can that principle be enacted in a more sensitive way that might have better consequences? So the first of these kind of controversies I've already spoken about, around colourblind policy. The British government at the moment say that a colourblind policy is the only fair way. The Home Secretary, the politician with personal responsibility for immigration, law and order and equality, has said we have to forget about these things like ethnicity. They're just boxes on a form. We have to remember that Britain is a nation of 62 million individuals. So forget about those wider things, gender, race. You're all individuals. Now, as I've already argued, the idea that colourblind is the best way forward actually rests on the assumption that if we don't talk about race and racism, it won't have any impact. But I've already shown you that racism operates in ways that are consistent and predictable and in many ways violent, but it happens through small-scale routine decisions. So to say we treat everyone the same might be a statement of intent. It's very rarely a statement of fact. Human beings have a tendency not to treat other groups of humans in the same way. So for example, if we think about what does a successful anti-racist school look like, and some of these insights might be useful to you in thinking about how do you work with different communities? How do you have a successful approach to museums in a multicultural and anti-racist vein rather than a colourblind vein? So these are the characteristics of schools that have made anti-racism work, where minoritised groups tend to achieve well and to feel involved, and where white folks also feel a legitimate stake in what goes on. Successful anti-racist schools also include white people just as much as minoritised groups. So when you look at the characteristics of a successful multicultural school, there's always strong leadership on social justice and race equality. There's not just a statement, well, we treat everyone the same. There is a real commitment to equity. The leadership team set goals and review things around social justice. And when something goes wrong, they remain committed to social justice issues. So people that work in the organisation know that if there's an issue around social justice, it will be followed up. In the same way, some of the organisations I've worked with in the past, people know that there's a rhetorical stance, but if something happens, actually the leadership don't care. And when the people in the organisation know that, it affects the way they operate. And that means leadership not just from inside the organisation, but also from on high. If the people who control funding or set the wider policy goals don't care about social justice, that has a toxic effect on what happens. So inequalities in English schools are getting worse at the moment because head teachers know that they're not judged on social justice issues. They're judged on what proportion of kids succeed. And really, for that judgment, it doesn't matter if all the white kids succeed and all the black students fail. And head teachers know that. So we need strong leadership, clear policies that address racism. In terms of schools, what do students do if they think something has happened that's racist? Who do they talk to? What should they expect to happen? What procedures will be followed? So people that work in the organisation need training because we don't know what to do. The first thing that most white people do when they're told of an accusation of racism is to say, oh, well, no, I'm sure you've misunderstood. It wasn't really meant like that. I'm sure you're being oversensitive. That's not how you handle racism. It's not how you handle sexism. So people in the organisation need training, not just teachers, everyone who works in a school, the people who serve lunch, they need training in these issues because they need to know what to do. And there needs to be some kind of involvement for minoritised students, parents and communities. Because they get these issues, they understand these issues better than the white folks who are in charge. So one of the schools that I've worked with had a really great anti-racist policy which came about because they put a draft in each classroom and minoritised kids went off and read it and came back with suggestions. Some of which were really simple, but just showed a better understanding of what the issues were than the very well-intentioned white teachers that had created the draft. And it just got a better momentum and it got buy-in from all of the different communities that fed into the school. You can't be serious about anti-racism for a month and then forget it. We'll come back to it next Black History Month. That's what most organisations do. You have to build it in to the way the place operates. Build it into the way you routinely look at your own performance. So in schools that means reviewing the curriculum, reviewing assessment procedures, disciplinary procedures. because these are the issues through which the racism and the sexism and the ableism often operate. And in terms of race, ethnic monitoring becomes a key component in how the organisation judges what it does. So you don't just sit around in a big circle in the staff room and say, have we been good anti-racists this term? You look at some data and say, actually, this group of students are not choosing to do science. Why is that? This group of students are not achieving well in mathematics. What are we going to do about it? You don't have an argument about, well, is it because they're eating the wrong food? Is it because they're genetically less intelligent? You say, well, this is a thing we have some control over. What can we do to change this distribution? So very simple monitoring becomes a key part of how the organisation reviews its own performance. These look like relatively simple steps. They're very threatening for some people. You'll make mistakes, but the evidence suggests that if you persevere with these, you can absolutely revolutionise what happens in the organisation. Now, another flashpoint is around freedom of speech versus race hatred. And some of these images will be somewhat familiar. I could put up just as many examples to the UK or to the US. Now, part of the problem with these issues is, again, the words we use to describe them. So when minoritized groups talk about race hatred through images like this, it's then presented very often in the media as a debate about censorship. That instantly tells the reader that this is an issue about control, about the removal of your majority rights, rather than saying this is an issue about protection, about extending the same protection to minoritized groups that we would expect if these acts of aggression and violence were directed against the majority group. And these are acts of violence. I mean, there are theories that talk about this, but really on a visceral level, I mean, this thing went viral around the world. I work with people who were made to feel physically ill just watching that video. This is not a kind of an issue for a university seminar room where we debate and we're terribly clever. Some of this stuff really hits in the gut, and it has consequences on the street. In the UK, we know that whenever a government minister makes a statement about immigration, the number of race attacks on the street goes up. We've known that for about 10 or 15 years. Now, these are complicated questions, and we can deal with each of them in isolation, but we also have to think about them in relation to those wider issues about power and oppression and violence. Again, there's no simple answer. There's a couple of things that I would point out. One is that every nation that I'm aware of has limits on speech. There are libel laws. There are slander laws. We're not able to just say whatever we want about anyone. Some states ban particular forms of hate speech. So some countries have separate laws around, for example, racist or homophobic speech. But there's always controversy when the majority feel that their privileges are being questioned. And when that happens, we have to think about the ways in which the debate is being staged. Is this a debate about freedom of expression, or is it a debate about legitimate protection of less powerful groups? And how do we ensure that all parts of that spectrum are listened to? Secondly, we have to constantly question our own assumptions, because none of these discourses operate in a social vacuum. Hate speech and derogatory images have different effects depending on race, class, gender, sexuality. White middle-class people are usually the most secure and the most privileged. So we're not usually the best judge of how those kinds of images will impact on the lived realities for minoritized groups. Doesn't matter how many degrees we have or how absolutely passionate we are about civil liberty, white privileged folk aren't the only people to have insight into these issues, and in many ways there are aspects of these debates that we cannot know. We have to listen to other people and their experiences if we're serious about understanding how we find a balance between these different issues. Okay, I said I'd talk for about 50 minutes. I'm up to an hour, so I'm going to wrap up quite quickly. I did warn somebody earlier that once I start talking, it becomes quite difficult to shut up. So I'll wrap up. I keep saying this is complicated. This is hard stuff. If this was easy, we'd have sorted it out. You could just get a book and find out how not to be a racist institution. It'd be fine. A few years ago, I was invited to a big meeting in Barcelona. Catalan had an influx of migrants over a 10-year period that completely reshaped the way it thought about issues. And so they brought in experts from around the world to say, look, we don't know how best to respond. Tell us what to do. And lots of us were there saying, well, look, whatever you do, don't imagine that it's just about language. It's not. It's about power. It's about the majority. And so they had a week-long thing where they heard from all the experts, and then they went, OK, we're going to teach them all how to speak our language. That will sort it out. Because that's what nation states do. Every nation state that's tried to deal with ethnic diversity, every one that I'm aware of, imagines it's just about language. Teach them to speak the dominant language, it'll be fine. In England, they're still saying that. Both major political parties' views on migration is, well, we just teach them how to speak English. There's no focus on what does the majority need to do. I'll teach them how to speak English, they'll be fine. Despite all of the evidence. So it's complicated. What I'm going to suggest we need to do is to de-centre whiteness. I'm not suggesting that white folks shut up. I'm going to explain what I mean by this image. I'm not telling you to be quiet. As you can see, I'm a white person. I speak quite a lot about racism. So I'm not one of those folks that says, actually, because I'm white, I can't have a legitimate voice on this, so I'll go and look at something else. That feels quite comfortable, but it's one of the ways in which race issues continue to be at the margin. I think there is a role for white folks, a very key role in terms of anti-racism. But the role involves decentering whiteness. By decentering, I mean taking the assumptions and the interests of white folks and shifting them away from the centre of the argument. Because, as I've argued, white people are not the experts when it comes to these issues. So all of the arguments that I've discussed about censorship, about policy, intention versus outcome, these issues are dominated by the interests and the assumptions of white people. So for white people, intent is crucial because we're afraid that we'll be accused of something we didn't mean to do. That's quite a scary situation to be in. We worry that we might not know what to do and that we might have to change things that we've always done it that way, but we might suddenly be faced with the idea that that's not the best way of doing something. So suddenly we're not the experts. Colourblind policy is easy because it means we're not part of the problem and we don't have to change anything because we just reassure ourselves we treat everyone the same. And freedom of expression becomes a convenient defence for actions that might be harmful either by design or by default, but if we're colourblind or we just have freedom of expression, we don't need to concern ourselves with that. So this is why genuine anti-racism is always difficult and always politically sensitive, because genuine anti-racism is about power. It requires that the majority change their actions. Now, very often people say to me, well, really, Dave, first you need to change the hearts and minds of people. The evidence actually suggests you don't. You can do it the other way round. If you make it harder for teachers to be racist, so you have more high-achieving minoritized students, you have more members of staff from minoritized groups, you find that their hearts and minds start to come along with it. They start to change their stereotypes about groups when they start to see the evidence against those earlier stereotypes. So I don't believe that we have to sit around and have lots of conversations before we can take action. I think we need to find ways of taking action, and then people will change their attitudes and their understandings as they're educated by the consequences of those actions. Now, what I mean by this image is you need to remove the tape. Because if you're serious about anti-racism, and I think this goes for other equality issues as well, it goes for issues around disability, goes for issues around gender and sexuality. Unless you stake a claim to a particular position, you will be carried along by the current. So at the airport, some airports with long walkways, you don't even have to walk anymore. You just get on the walkway at one end with your bag and you find yourself 100 metres at the other end without taking a single step. Racism is like that. For white people in societies like this, you can get on the walkway and be carried along perfectly nicely. You can think, I've never taken a racist action in my life, but you've benefited from it and you've probably contributed without knowing, because you're just carried along on the conveyor belt of racism because it saturates the society. So if you don't want to be carried along, you have to get off the conveyor belt. And sometimes you have to go in the opposite direction. That's not easy. There are costs. It feels very uncertain. You'll probably make mistakes, but if you're genuine about it and you work with different folks in different groups, they will show you how to take the steps and where to go. Critical approaches to racism are sometimes accused of being very depressing. You see racism everywhere. If it's so common, why bother? It's everywhere. Why should we bother? Well, actually, critical approaches show that the reason it's everywhere, it shows us that we all need to bother. And actually, change is possible. We might not change the entire society, but there's a lot of evidence that even working as individuals, we can make huge differences. So the project that I mentioned earlier about black middle-class parents, one of the key findings from that is that 30 or 40 years after these people left school, they can still tell you about the one teacher who showed an interest in them. They can still remember the teacher's name. And they can tell you about a particular incident where that teacher took them on one side and said, look, this is what we're going to do. Or handed them an extra book. Or talked to the parent and said, look, you really need to do such and such. So even in the most oppressive, racist environment, a single teacher can change the life course for the students that they're coming into contact with. And I'm absolutely convinced that that works in all agencies. It's better if the leadership are on your side, but even if there's just you, there are things that you can do. But the more you can link up with other people and try and move things forward as an organisation, the better. I apologise, I've kept going on. I will stop at that point. Okay, thank you. I think issues like the controversy around the cake, around the Tintin book, these things reoccur over time in different nations and in the same nation. The issue is never completely resolved. It tends to keep on reoccurring. I think part of the reason for that is often a kind of underlying tension around ethnic diversity and around issues of power. And I think particularly at the moment, right around the Western world, there's an enormous sense of uncertainty linked to the economic collapse in 2008. And at moments of such uncertainty, historically, people tend to reach for things like nationalism to reassure themselves that they're safe, that everything isn't changing, and that they still have power over something. And I think that's why it's a particularly dangerous moment right now in terms of ethnic diversity, because in nations right across Europe, in the US, in Canada, there's a kind of drive to reassert the rights of the ethnic majority. White people in the UK, in Sweden, in the US, in Canada, it seems to me are reasserting this is our nation. And we can have very important debates about the colonial past. All of these nations have a colonial past. It's not the same past, but all of the nations of Europe are built to some degree on a colonial legacy, whether they know it, whether they acknowledge it. And they need to come to terms with that and to understand it. And I think controversies like the ones around the cake really act as flashpoints very often, where what's happening is that minoritized groups are saying these things are offensive, these things sometimes lead to direct violence against us. You are treating us as less than human, and you need to be more aware. And what tends to happen is that the group with the majority of power says, you don't get to tell us what to do. We believe in freedom of speech, or we don't like censorship. And that becomes, that very good principle is then perverted to become a defense. It becomes an argument that we get to say and do whatever we like. So there has to be some kind of real dialogue between different groups to understand how we can use these issues to move forward, to have a better understanding of each other, but also of ourselves, a better understanding of our colonial past and how we came to this particular situation. Otherwise, we'll just keep on remaking the mistakes of the past. These issues are always very complicated, and they're always politically sensitive, because we're not simply talking about a question of simple fact, that there's one way of representing the past or understanding the present. We're talking about differences of experience. So an image which looks playful to one group may be highly offensive to another group. And rather than the majority simply asserting its right to do whatever it wants, or saying, well, our perspective is the correct one, what we need is some greater kind of intercultural dialogue, a greater willingness to understand how these things are experienced by other groups. So, for example, an organisation entirely populated by white middle-class professionals is not best placed to understand the experience of minoritized groups in society, in the same way that men are not the best placed people to understand how to deal with sexual violence against women. You have to involve different perspectives, different understandings. So if you're an all-white organisation, that means you have to find ways of working with minoritized groups, work with different communities, work with different individuals, different artists. Sometimes things will go wrong because, for example, my understanding was the cake was made by a black man. And to kind of address issues around sexual violence, female circumcision. So even the most well-intentioned man doesn't get those issues, doesn't understand those issues in the same way as the women who are on the receiving end of that kind of sexual violence. So you need to involve those other groups. And if you make a mistake, if you do something that's really well intentioned but offends one of the groups that you want to work with, you have to learn from that. You have to say, I made a mistake. Talk with the group. How would we have done this better? What would be a different way of working? To simply say, oh, well, I intended something else, isn't good enough. These things are very complicated, and we all make mistakes. I make mistakes in the ways in which I do my work sometimes, and I have to listen when students or colleagues suggest that there's a different way of understanding an issue or a different way of talking about it. So these things are never complete. You can't take a course on anti-racism and suddenly become an expert and never make a mistake again. We constantly keep tripping up because these issues are complicated and they change. Racism operates in different ways. So there's no simple solution, but working with different groups of people and taking their views seriously, I think, is one of the best ways of starting to address the issue. Walk into the arrivals lounge and we say to the Brazilians in the arrival lounge, is my friend black? And the majority would say, no, your friend's not black. Because black means different things in the US to what it means in Brazil. And it means different things in the US now to what it meant 40 years ago, 100 years ago. So although we're presented with race as if it's a fixed biological thing, it's not. It's an invention. It's an invention which is continually remade over time in human interaction. Now, because of that, some people put quotation marks around the word. So when they use the word race, they put a quotation mark around it to say, well, I know there's no such thing really, but I have to use the word. Some academics say, well, if there's no such thing as race, we shouldn't use the word. That's quite a nice argument in a university seminar room, but it doesn't work very well in the real world. Because if you want to do something about inequalities that are associated with race, getting rid of the language doesn't help you. It's difficult to address racism if you refuse all language connected with race. So it gets very messy. The terms that we use keep changing, and our understanding of the issues changes from time to time. So it feels very uncertain. But the guiding principle for me is always what helps us to understand where the inequality comes from and what we can do about it. So if it means that my book published this year uses terms that are different to the book published 10 years ago, so be it. There are more important things than getting hung up on a particular word at a particular time. So I'm going to particularly look at the issue of racism. Racism is a complicated idea, and it changes over time. Now, traditionally, we tend to think of racists as folks that look like that. It's a bit unfortunate that my hairstyle matches the archetypal racist, but I'm just trying to subvert the code, you know. I'm going to outline what I'm going to call a critical understanding of racism, the idea of what racism is and how it might manifest itself. Then I'm going to say something very briefly about the demographic situation in England so that you can see some of the comparisons. And then I'm going to look in particular at how racism operates in practice through the actions of teachers and policymakers. And finally, I'm going to say something about what I've called flashpoints. So controversial questions, issues that over time in different nation states keep on reoccurring. Questions about censorship, about whose insights carry most validity. And I'll try and say something there about not just the particular issues, but maybe some principles that we can adopt in taking forward our understanding of those issues. So if we start with the idea of race and racism, as you probably know, it's widely accepted that there's no such thing as separate human races. There is one human race. The idea of consistent, biologically defined subgroups, which we can legitimately call different human races, has been exploded over certainly the last 30 odd years. The physical characteristics which are usually taken to denote race, things like skin tone, those characteristics are given different meanings at different times and in different societies. So although we kind of grow up thinking that race is obvious and fixed, a kind of natural thing, it's actually not obvious or fixed. Race changes over time and it means different things in different societies. So for example, I could stand with a friend in the departure lounge at JFK in New York and say to the Americans in the departure lounge, "Is my friend black?" And the majority of Americans would say, "Yeah, your friend's black." We get on a plane, we fly to Rio de Janeiro. So I'm going to speak for about 45, 50 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. If you've got any questions, it's probably best to save them until the end, because part of the structure of the talk is to try and build different arguments on top of each other. So it's a little bit like a jigsaw, that if we focus on one part of it, the effect won't be quite as good as if you wait until the end. That's the theory anyway. It may not work out quite like that, but that's what I tell myself. So I'm going to speak particularly about racism and education. So a lot of the insights you'll need to kind of translate into your own particular working arena. I think some of the insights will be very directly applicable. Others may not be. Some of them may be a bit more general, but I think you'll certainly be able to make those connections as I go along. And as I say, very happy to enter into discussion at the end for as long as you want about how some of these things may or may not translate into your own particular work environment. So it's a great honour to be here speaking about these things. It's also a little bit strange, because part of the emphasis of my work is about not just the things that we know, but the things that we don't know. So I'm very aware that as an academic from England, there's an awful lot about the situation here that I don't know. Having said that, we live in a globalised world where a lot of political and demographic shifts happen not just across countries, but also across continents. So I think there are certainly some aspects of the situation here which are directly applicable, and maybe some of the differences will help us to understand our own situations a little bit better. So I was asked to talk in particular about the issue of racism in relation to policy and practice in education. And as I talk, these are the issues I'm going to try and cover. So first of all, to say something about the ideas of race and racism. In particular, people that look like us are the minority. So even the terms that we're using to try and understand the debate sometimes smuggle in a slanted understanding of the word. So when I talk about minoritized people, I'm talking about groups that have been kind of created through political and historical processes to have a particularly different status in certain nation states. So in a critical perspective on racism, you can't identify racism by only looking for crude and obvious acts of race hatred, because racism is much more subtle than that. So in a critical perspective, you identify racism through the effect of actions and policies. If an action or a policy has the effect of disadvantaging one or more minoritized groups, then its impacts may be racist regardless of its intentions. Now, this is vital because policymakers talk a lot about their good intentions, but what matters from a critical perspective is the impact of decisions, not the intention behind them. So one of the particular kind of controversies I'm going to talk about later is an approach that's sometimes called colour blindness. The idea that, well, if we ignore race and treat everyone the same, that will guarantee fairness. Now, actually, that's one of the best ways of normalising racism, of taking race inequalities and making them look natural. And I'll say quite a bit about colourblind approaches. One key example is very often if you're looking to recruit someone to a course in higher education or to a job, if you just say, well, we don't accept people with qualifications below this single cut-off point. And the argument is, well, it's fair. If you have qualifications below this level, we're not going to consider you. But if you live in a society where certain minoritized groups have significantly less overall educational achievement. So traditionally, we associate racism with kind of neo-Nazi, clear white supremacists. The idea that dominates in the media and politics is a very stable and actually a very narrow view of what racism is. So the dominant perspective sees racism as something that's quite exceptional. It doesn't happen very often. Racism is a conscious act by people who know what they're doing. It's driven through race hatred. And we might identify racism through the use of hate speech or through deliberate acts, often of quite a crude or even a violent nature. So in the traditional perspective, racism doesn't happen often, but when it happens, it's very obvious and it's willingly enacted. Racists know who they are and what they're doing. Now, in contrast to that image of racism, a critical perspective has a very different view of what racism is and how it operates in society. And very often it operates through people who are smiling and well-intentioned. Very often the smile is not knowingly false. In education, some of the key race inequalities arise through the actions of people who are really trying their best. So a critical perspective on racism views racism as something which is extensive and taken for granted. Racism as something which is a daily occurrence for many people in minoritized groups. And I use the word minoritized. I came across this first when I was doing some work in Canada, and scholars there were using it to kind of remind themselves and others that being a minority is a political construction, like being a member of a race is a social construction. So we tend to imagine that certain people are minorities because they're born a minority, whereas actually to become a minority is part of a political process. In terms of the